You mentioned Foamasi?
Ready when you are.
Tachyons, Aztecs, and Undertakers, all in this 8th edition of I'll Explain Later, with your hosts Matt Needer,
Jim Hall,
and John West.
A startling new era of TV has launched with deck chairs, dismemberment, and dumpy dragon detectives. Can Tom Baker use an awe-inspiring helmet to stop Adrian Corey's pods dropping off? We book into 1980s The Leisure Hive.
With the gaseous Gelth terrorising Cardiff, Rose's bosom and a randy funeral director ensure it's not just the corpses which are stiff. The best and worst of times for the 9th Doctor in the Unquiet Dead.
And the Doctor's friend Ian gets a prick in a punch-up, while Billy Hartnell gets jiggy after he imbibes an exotic substance from South America. We dissect 1964 historical, The Aztecs.
Hi, Happy New Year. Welcome to this January edition of I'll Explain Later.
Who can believe it? 2000... Oh, no, sorry, that's a different story.
Well, we're here to compound your January blues anyway. And we're going to get... Well, what better, actually? We're going to start off by looking at a story which didn't kick off the 80s, but it certainly kicked off a whole new era for Doctor Who. The Leisure Hive, which is the first story which John Nathan Turner produced. So the setup here is Tom Baker. It's the beginning of his last season as the 4th Doctor. He and Romana go to Argolis, a planet which is inhabited by a kind of plant people.
The Renettes. It's inherited by the sort of Renettes.
They have got some extraordinary do's, haven't they?
I thought the planets of the Sprout people. They've kind of got a... yeah.
Yes, who run a big... It's meant to be a holiday centre with various bits and pieces.
It's a glorified centre parks, basically.
Yeah.
The Argolans are in trouble. They're a sterile race. They're dying out. They're getting some business advances from their old enemies, the Foamasi, who are kind of reptile people who will come out. We'll explain in the fullness of time.
Yeah.
There are a few things we need to explain about this, because at the centre of it are things like a tachyon generator, which does weird things with images. And the Doctor gets hideously aged.
In a way, it's sort of perhaps best to start off with the kind of the sort of big picture stuff, in that, and this is one of the things that really struck me, is how little attention is ever paid to the story when discussing this. I mean, in some ways, this is the start of a new era. This is the new lick of paint that's been put on Doctor Who, and in some ways it sets up stuff that is going to define the series throughout the rest of the decade. But there is also a story and an adventure going on in there, and it's sort of that... I'd seen the first 2 episodes of this probably about 20 years ago, never seen the full story, and coming to it sort of relatively fresh, like realised, actually, I don't know what happens in this. I don't know what's going on. Yeah, and having watched it, I'm still not sure.
Yeah, it's not a very nutshell story, really, is it? I'm getting the sense neither of you guys enjoyed this particularly already.
My hot take on this was that it was all right. Not great, not egregiously bad. It had its moments. I think David Haig is a hoot.
Oh, David Haig's great
as the sort of
Pangol.
Yes, as a sort of
angry young man,
basically. And I did quite like. So I mean, you talked about them being they created this Leisure Hive as sort of glorified centre parks as a sort of place for people to have a holiday. The older generation of this species have decided that it's also going to be a sort of cultural centre where aliens and different species of different cultural and genetic backgrounds, I think was one of the phrases, could mix and learn more about each other. And then the younger, what's he called? Pangol.
Yeah.
The David Haig character, he's much more zealous and in fact harks back to the sort of exclusive nationalism that got them into trouble in the first place with their neighbouring planet.
Well, that's the thing that works best about the story, I think, or at least is most interesting about this as a story, and not sort of separating out all the aesthetic elements, which we'll come on to shortly. But it is...
we will get to the aesthetics.
We will get to that, yeah. But it is a very dense bit of world building that sort of feels... I think there's a huge number of elements of this that look forward to aspects of the new series, kind of the current series, kind of good and ill. There's a lot more world building going on in here than you normally associate with classic Doctor Who, and it kind of drops you into it very, very quickly. It's very dense, this sort of both the sort of cultural history of this planet that they're on, and also recent events, and the sort of the business angle that comes into it. There's a sort of
then interpersonal things with some scientist having a bit of a fling with one of the members of the board, and some time experiments. There's a lot going on in here.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly. I always quite like stories that kind of drop you into a world. And sort of leave you. It's that sort of ice cubing thing, really, isn't it? You show you enough to imply that there is a lot more to the society going on, underneath. It's not like sort of in classic Doctor Who, you'll land on a planet that is perhaps a kind of religious cult, or there's some basic idea like the Roman Empire never fell, or something like that. There's an awful lot going on here that it leaves you to sort of tease out. I'm not sure if it's done particularly elegantly.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big thing with this is the first time we're reviewing a David Fisher script, and I think he's a bit of an unsung hero of Doctor Who.
What else did he write? I can't remember.
Well, he had a big run for about 3 years, and he did, Stones of Blood...
Oh, yes.
Androids of Tara.
And he basically did City of Death.
He basically did the setup of City of Death and Creature from the Pit. Now, in terms of how much I enjoy those stories, it does vary a bit. But I think he's a really good writer in terms of his approach to Doctor Who seems to be what would be a weird situation to put them in. Or Androids of Tara. Let's do Prisoner of Zenda, but with robots instead of a look-alike,
Yeah, he's an
I think he's a
man,
really
isn't
good...
he?
Yeah, I don't think any of those scripts are pretty much just doing, this worked last time, so I'm going to do it again.
No.
Which you get with a lot of other writers. But this, kind of as with City of Death, which famously was David Fisher, but Douglas Adams and Graham Williams rewrote it from scratch, really. This, I get a feeling that Chris Bidmead, and this is his first story as script editor, I get the sense he rewrote this pretty thoroughly, just in terms of the dialogue and things.
Yeah.
He's getting all of that new scientist lingo in there.
But the structure is quite elegant. I think some of the dialogue doesn't quite sit right, and will, as Matt has said, will get onto the aesthetic qualities of it. But I did like the fact that actually it's quite late in the day that it's revealed who the villain is. It's not at all clear, really. You think it's the lizard people. Sorry,
the Foamasi.
The Foamasi.
Which,
Fugazi. No, the Foamasi. You think it's them, and it turns out... Sorry, spoilers. It turns out it isn't. It's
well, they're part of it.
It's Panadol or whatever he's called.
I think it has some cracking cliffhangers as well. I think.
Well, that's my big note, is that the cliffhangers on this are outstanding, and by far and away the best of it. I mean, all three of them just really land as a
the
proper
third
crescendo.
one, which is the reveal John's just spoken about. Well, not quite. It sort of rounds off one story before another one starts up pretty much in the last act. The editing on that is a bit confused, which I suppose brings us on to the aesthetics of it. Lovett Bigford directed this, and this is famously the only time he directed Doctor Who, because I think he either went over budget or over time or both. But a very distinct look to it, I think.
Well,
Not
I mean,
just...
the production problems on this are sort of legion. There are all sorts of parallels between this and certain aspects of the new series. I think particularly the Moffat era, that you've kind of got a new broom coming in, and you sort of see the teething problems of wrenching the series into a new direction. So obviously John Nathan Turner's big sort of bottom line idea was that Doctor Who needed to be...
JNT have a big bottom line?
Terrific, Jim. Well done. Is that how many? 5 minutes in? Yeah. But his big idea was that sort of Doctor Who should be that sci-fi had changed in the late 70s with the arrival of Star Wars and Close Encounters and all these other sort of big budget films. And also American series like Buck Rogers in the 25th Century, I believe,
was opposite this.
Running opposite this at the time. That Doctor Who needed to up its game in terms of visuals and excitement and aesthetics. So you get new title sequence, new music, new look for the show. Yeah, Tom Baker's outfit is
all burgundy.
Exactly. It's much more
and the
designed.
question marks come in, don't they?
Yes, this is where we first arrival of the lovely question marks. But also, I mean, the incidental music, for example, it's wall-to-wall incidental music made by cutting-edge means. It's
on synths rather than Dudley Simpson's little... Yeah.
And it's sort of vaguely contemporaneous with the kind of big... It's not as good, but the sort of big synth scores that you would get, around this time for films like Blade Runner, what Vangelis is doing. I know that Nathan Turner was very influenced by Jean-Michel Jarre. He kind of wanted to bring that aesthetic to Doctor Who. But the direction as well. So you mentioned Lovett Bickford, who went over budget, went over time, and clearly got his episodes under running as well. I mean, these are short. This is a short story. The whole thing's like 86 minutes end to end rather than 100. Apparently, part of the reason for that sort of stems from his cinematic ambitions for what they all wanted to do. And what actually comes out now, I mean, once you get past the sort of the shock of the new, what's really interesting about the aesthetics of this is that you can sort of feel you feel the hand of the process kind of much more strongly. So in our first episode, we reviewed the story that preceded this, The Horns of Nimon. And obviously, in some ways, there's an attempt to get a bit of clear blue water between what was going on there and what was going on here.
I think there's only 8 months difference between the broadcast times of those two stories.
But actually, the thing that is really striking about this is the similarities, that in some ways, you know, they kind of have the same resources available to them. The budget hasn't really changed. The kind of way that you might go about shooting in a studio hasn't changed. You know, the way that the sets are constructed hasn't changed. But sort of aesthetically and creatively and artistically, what they're trying to do in that space has gone up a notch. Like, their ambitions have gone up a notch.
It's really strange, aesthetically, how much that 8-month gap. Yeah, because they are quite similar stories in the sense that there's a sort of there's a bit of scientific business going on. You know, Nimon and Leisure Hive. There's a bit of scientific business going around. There's a sort of corridors and what have you. So, and there's a sort of mad, wide-eyed villain. Well, it turns out there is a mad, wide-eyed villain at the end. But you're so right. It's aesthetically, it's very clear that Nimon is sort of the 70s. I mean, I know it sort of struck just into the 80s, but you know, it would have been all recorded in the 70s, and this feels like the 80s.
Yeah,
the soundtrack you mentioned, it reminded me so much of the For Your Eyes Only soundtrack.
Oh, really?
You know, there's that sort of there's sort of that very early 80s sort of disco and synth pop elements in
I know
there
what you
that
mean.
really.
And I mean, For Your Eyes Only is an unusual one because it's not John Barry, is it? It's
No. Bill Conti.
Yeah.
Good knowledge.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you say Bond, because the thing this reminds me of, in a weird way, is when Dalton was Bond, and it was an attempt to really do something new, but it still really didn't want to 100% commit, and so you've got Dalton trying to do Roger Moore lines looking quite grim, and this is the reverse. It's got a show that's trying to be quite stark and a little bit Hitchhiker's Guide, but you've got Tom Baker arsing around a little bit too much in there.
Well, I don't know.
I think if you listen to the commentary, Chris Bidmead's groaning at some of the lines that obviously should have been edited out.
Well,
stuff.
That said, I do think that his performance does seem to be more muted.
I think he's quite pissed off, rather than just pissed.
Oh, right.
I think he's getting reined in here, and he's like, "Oh my god!" He's clearly thinking, "Am I going to do this again next year?"
But the thing about Tom Baker's performance in this is that, because we've sort of seen, with the 3 Tom Baker stories that we've discussed on this, we've sort of seen all 3 iterations of Tom Baker, really. You've seen sort of early Tom Baker, where he's kind of tightened on the leash and has a good read on it. We've seen indulgent Tom Baker in Horns of Nimon. And I really like him in this. I think he's great. I think, because almost
agree.
Getting him back on the leash, sort of, and obviously he's kind of bristling at having his wings clipped and being put into this new costume.
And being sober.
Yeah. But actually that kind of brooding, funereal sort of vibe that he gives off is something very new compared to what we've seen him do previously.
I agree. I think he does that very well.
Yeah. And that's my one sort of big takeaway that I love about this season. I mean, it's a season I've got very mixed feelings on, but that idea of, you know, the Doctor as it's a huge gear shift. Him, the 4th Doctor, being so sort of somber and funereal and you know, with all the sort of doom and portent of everything that is to come down the line for him is great, and he pulls it off beautifully.
This is one of my favourite Doctor Who seasons for that reason, which is I quite like the fact that it's, I think other people have described it as the hangover after all of the party that they've been having before. As a kid watching this as 8-year-old, I remember just thinking, oh man, is he going to go now? You know, I was impatient for him to go. And now I love the fact that, yes, it's sombre and funereal. And part of that is Tom Baker realising the gig is up.
Yeah.
But
there's a creative winding down as well, isn't there?
And it's, as I get older, I appreciate that more and more. And even if I think it's a happy accident, but I think all of the stories in this season play into that a little bit. So there is a lot of thing about old empires crumbling and the theme of entropy and all of that, which isn't just me being fancy. Entropy is definitely throughout this season.
Yeah. sorry, perhaps it's a more mundane point, but we were talking about him having gone through the tachyon recreation generator.
Yeah, which is kind of an optical effect, really, isn't it?
Yeah,
are you talking about the first cliffhanger or the second?
It's very strange. For me, they never really adequately. Like it's not quite clear. Are they images or copies or
the science is incredibly confusing. I mean, what I've written down here is the babble about tachyonics is bloody hard to follow.
Yeah,
and actually
what it's meant to, not just pinning it down, but what actually is it meant to be? Is it just meant to be actually a Photoshop?
Yeah,
I think it's just meant to be an image of someone.
There's meant to be images
that you can manipulate and make their arms and legs fly around.
But then you can. But there's a sense, of course, that that's physically also what's happening because of that. It is. I mean, it is quite. It's poorly rendered, perhaps as a visual. But when the poor chap's legs and arms get pulled off, and his head, and I love the bit where they say, "Oh God, it seems like he's died." And they just cut from a picture where his head was clearly off his body.
I'm going to break that. Yeah, the initial thing you see is his head coming off. And then the doctor goes in and comes out and said, he's terribly hurt. Really? Yes. And then some minutes later, Visitor Loman has died or expired or whatever. Really?
But for me, that aspect of it is sort of where the Bidmead approach falls down because you can appreciate, I really do appreciate what he was trying to do in terms of getting a bit of science fiction rigour in there. But where, and I'm immediately lost for an example, so hopefully you can plug the gap on this, but, where science-based episodes of Doctor Who work, or where science-based popular science fiction works, is where you might take an idea, an extrapolation of something, and develop that as your sort of running plot point. Here, like the tachyonics and the machine is sort of integral to the plot, but sort of isn't. But there's been obviously been an edict that if we're doing science, we have to make it work.
Well, the tachyon thing is the MacGuffin here, isn't it?
It's a magic box, really.
Yeah,
it's meant to be set up as an entertainment, and then is eventually used as a more of a rejuvenating kind of.
But in terms of in story structure sense, it's a MacGuffin. It's a thing that allows the story to take place.
But in terms of whether it works, it's kind of. I mean, the problem is that it's neither interesting enough in its delving into the science to think, oh, well, that's a fascinating idea, nor is it dramatic. And actually, some of the scenes where, what's his name? Hardin.
Yeah, Nigel Lambert.
Yes, the scenes where they are, him and Romana are doing the time experiments are absolutely interminable, and they seem to go on forever. It's just
and the props are terrible.
The two of them just fiddling around with stuff
with egg timers, which
egg timers
have you turned back time or just invented zero gravity? I'm not sure. But,
yeah, it's all very bizarre.
Well, your comment about the props—that's exactly the point I was sort of trying to make earlier about. What's almost more striking now that the shock of this being very new and looking very new has kind of worn off. The bits that stand out to me as a viewer, or at least kind of watching this with a critical eye, are the bits that are similar to Naimon. So actually the sort of slightly lousy cellophane props. The corridors in this look exactly like the corridors in Naimon.
They do, except they've filmed them like they're in West Wing or something. They're all having these conversations and walking into the camera and then holding the editing a bit too long before they walk the opposite direction.
They've got the same box of tricks, but they are trying to deploy them in a way that's more considered and more ambitious. But ultimately, with the problems that they had making this and the fact that Lovett Bickford would never come back because he cocked this one up so badly in terms of budget and schedule.
But just in terms of the design thing, I find it really strange that the sets generally, as you sort of were talking about, the corridors and what have you, they look just very plain and boring. And yet there's one scene where Stimson, the chap in
Eddie Jordan.
Yeah.
The
David Alistair.
He looks like Eddie Jordan, doesn't he? He's the guy with the beard and the glasses.
Yes,
whose glasses drop off, but he doesn't notice.
That's right. Yes, his glasses drop off.
He's not even running away, just kind of strolling away.
He's strolling away. His glasses fall off. It's very bizarre.
Yeah, but just so a foot can smash them dramatically.
Bad. But it's never good when someone smashes some glasses. Yeah. But so Stimson goes into this room where he finds the sort of Brock skin costume.
Yeah,
and Stimson, that room where Brock's skin costume is luscious and beautiful, and there's really 80s, and there's pastel shades and everything, and you see that room for about 10 seconds. It's really strange.
Never see it again.
It's the same for me as in the last episode. You get 4 Foamasi, and all right, they don't look brilliant, but I guess they still cost a bit to do.
Yeah,
you think they're only in it for like a minute.
I
Usually
love
you
the
could
Foamasi, though.
Well,
I
they
think
do.
the
They're
Foamasi are
kind
great.
of like chirruping. They're kind of like a lizard budgie made out of a beanbag or something.
Again,
They look like the kind of creatures that would be on stage with super furry animals, don't they?
they're really charming, though, aren't they?
Yeah.
And especially this bizarre bit. I mean, throughout it, you've had this character. Is it Brock? The
I think
Omar
it is
Sharif,
with Brock.
Omar Sharif kind of looking guy.
The commercial guy.
Yeah, and at the end when this they're using the traitor's voice synthesizer, I love all of that.
That's brilliant.
I think it's accidentally lovely and ridiculous.
Yeah.
I think it's very conscious, actually, and that's sort of something, again, that is coming back to sort of the areas where the series hasn't moved on from the previous year. I think there are notes of Douglas Adams sort of still shot through kind of how everyone's doing things. I know that John Nathan Turner's sort of thing was that he wanted to get rid of what he perceived as the undergraduate humour of the Douglas Adams era. But that idea, which I think is a very carefully thought out kind of aesthetic choice, the idea that this lizard thing would take the voice synthesizer is great. And it works so well. And it's having that voice as well, not just like a robot voice or something.
It's a very urbane voice, isn't it? It's kind of like if you saw a fat lizard talking like David Niven or something.
It's brilliant. And it kind of adds to a sort of... I mean, the thing I really like about the Foamasi is the design, where there's something where they've embraced the artificiality about it. So it's kind of a bit like a sort of Japanese stage puppet or something. In that you can sort of see it's kind of impressionistic rather than it is actually meant to look like a giant lizard.
I'm going to backtrack on that. I think it was more the designer came up with this reflective material because it's 2 layers. But she didn't know the director was going to do huge close-ups of the eyes swiveling around and stuff.
But I like that, the swivelling eyes, the sort of puppet-like quality of it, and then the ridiculous... Well, not the ridiculous,
do you
but
think
the
the
kind of
Foamasi were like the
contrived
war
voice.
horse of their day then or something? They could have...
I know you've said that as a joke, but it genuinely, I think it kind of does... I mean, for me, it kind of worked in that same space. It's that... It's that sort of embracing the impressionistic artificiality.
Wow, it's Brechtian Doctor Who then at some
It really worked for me, and then obviously had a great payoff in that sort of final scene where the Foamasi turns up at the end to clear everything up, and he goes, "You mentioned Foamasi?" Which is great. I really enjoyed that
with his finger held aloft as well. It's a lovely moment.
I do love the fact that he seems to have. Maybe they are just very urbane by nature. But the voice seemed
That's
to really
coming through in the
and the performance. It was really wonderful. While we're on the subject of the voice, though, you mentioned already Nigel Lambert as Harding, and of course him playing a scientist when he's the voice of Look Around You. I just thought it was delicious, and it was so like I must confess I did generally find that my attention sapped a little through the 4 episodes.
The science bit.
But when as soon as Nigel Lambert, who of course is an accomplished voice actor, every time he spoke I really perked up because his voice is so lovely.
Well, the guest cast in this are great, aren't they?
You know?
I mean, it's like Nigel Lambert's great, the David Haig is great. Who's the
David
guy
Haig's
playing
very
Brock?
I don't know. I have looked him up in the past. I don't think he did a huge amount more.
He's great as well.
He's called John Collin, and he has a Wikipedia entry, so I'm going to click through.
I think he was like a regular guest star in ITZ shows or something, but I don't think he had a big thing.
He was in Z-Cars.
Oh, well, there you go.
And Adrienne Corey from Clockwork Orange, very briefly. Yes. Well, she's briefly in Clockwork Orange. She's kind of like the big guest star here.
And her pods fall off.
Which is another thing which, because of the editing, I don't know if that did that come across to you, what was happening very clearly?
The way they'd sort of attempted to go for a kind of... Yeah, I mean, we
should explain what it means.
It looks so... So basically, as the
they have a steady metabolism, but then they age very rapidly.
Start to age. They have these sort of pods on their head, don't they, which drop off
with an amusing electronic plink.
Yeah, it does. It seems really silly the way it happens.
It undercuts the somber.
Yeah, I did laugh at that.
Tom Baker's hideously aged for 2 episodes here.
Oh yeah, that's the other
great.
Thing. Yeah, I think the makeup is terrific.
The makeup's really good, and it's great that it's not just
considering
a
how the
cliffhanger
new
and it's
series
sorted
has
out.
Struggled with aging makeup. I mean, there's been some terrible aging makeup in the new series, whereas like that was great. He looks convincingly.
Yeah.
And he plays it fairly doddery as well. You get the sense he is losing his marbles a little bit, but it's still some of his sharpness in.
And
there,
he really conveys the exhaustion of being. You know, I mean, there's a bit where he has to have a bit of a sit down. You know, I like that very much.
No, I mean these were all things that were very striking as a kid, but I remember not enjoying the fact the show had moved on and was less cozy. You know, I didn't have the vocabulary, but I remember thinking it was clinical. It lost its warmth, you know.
Well,
and now I really like it for that reason.
And yet, how self-indulgent is that opening to episode 1?
I was literally about to bring us onto that opening shot, which is extraordinary.
Because just if anyone hasn't seen it, it's Brighton Beach, and there's very sort of somber, eerie music, low tones, and the camera pans for what feels like an eternity.
I mean, it is really long.
Like really long, and it pans over empty deck chairs and sort of
wind-blown deck chairs.
Yeah, and you think, oh my god, this is properly sinister. And the payoff is a trill from I Do Like to Be Beside the Seaside, and they're having a bit of a...
And the Doctor snoring in a deck chair with a hat over his eyes.
It's a
mixture of like a Peter Greenaway tracking shot and the cover of Pink Floyd's Momentary Lapse of Reason.
But that did feel like a very sort of...
it's self-indulgent.
Douglas Adams sort of...
I don't know, I think it is very much, here we are, this is the JNT era we're going for.
But that's the thing.
Now I'm thinking it may have just been padding, you know, a bit like those constant shots of what's meant to be a ship docking on an airlock.
Yes, they go on for a while as well.
With the sub-bolero music.
Oh, by the way,
by the
way, that ship docking rocket thing.
Yeah,
that
not
visual
clear
is
what's going on.
It's no idea what's going on at all.
It's like someone was playing Duck Hunt or something.
I thought the TV had dropped out. But no, that opening shot. Sorry, the on Brighton Beach, dramatically. Or narratively, what is it for?
Well, this is the thing that for me kind of joined it up with the Moffat era. And actually I think this sort of runs through the sort of successes and failures of this story. Is that, I mean, there is a lot of showboating in this, but there is also a lot what sort of creeps in here, and I think obviously they try with diminishing returns throughout the rest of the 80s, is this sort of creation of iconic moments with some connective tissue between. So there's this idea that, you know, you're going to have memorable aliens, you're going to have absolutely killer cliffhangers, and a certain kind of fetishized kind of photography of the Doctor. The opening to this feels to me exactly, because it's a non sequitur cold opening, which feels you get time and time again in the Moffat episodes where it starts off with something and then it kind of teases an adventure off somewhere else. I'm thinking sort of maybe A Good Man Goes to War or something, which has got 4 or 5 of those strung together in very quick succession.
Bells of St. John as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's that sort of idea that you'll have some sort of iconic moment for, and I don't actually think this is necessarily a bad thing, but an iconic moment for the sake of a memorable iconic moment that has a sort of disconnect from the rest of the story. Feels
but this
to me
is really
now,
bad.
I mean, the more I think about I kind of like it, but I think if they'd only done it for half the time, it might work.
Yeah, I mean, it's undisciplined, but it's quite good.
It makes me think JNT as his first story was a little bit like Pangol when he's like, no, I must be the leader. And it's kind of like him saying, get rid of those Graham Williams. I'm really making my statement of intent that this is my new era now.
I mean, and it's much better than opening with a sort of conversation in the TARDIS, as you would have got previously, and then endlessly, you know, I mean, Adric Tegan and Nissa bickering slightly.
I mean, that whole scene is just
slowly lead us into the story.
That whole scene is there to get rid of K9, which happens most stories this season, and there's the little bit when Romana kind of does a setup of where they're going. So
there is that.
Which, disastrously, I think she's describing what the planet's history is and what they do now, and the Doctor ends up snoring, which is a bit of a bad portent for the audience, isn't it?
It is rather. I think I suppose what really just disappointed me about it was the fact that when I opened, I'd never seen it before, and when I was watching the opening to that first episode, I thought that, because I hadn't done any research, I thought it was really sinister, and that, you know, it was really strange that there was no sign of life and it was all empty, and then it was just a gag, and it seemed a bit of a waste of a really like eerie shot to then just finish it with a gag. To me, it just a bit weird.
A couple of other things I just want to say at the end. Since I watched this when I was very young, I've always thought Romana's outfit in this is one of her very best.
She looks amazing on the back of her.
She's in like a Victorian stripy bathing outfit and a sailor's jacket,
She looks terrific.
It wasn't until sometimes later I realised this is almost definitely Death in Venice, isn't it? It's the little boy that Bogart's obsessed with, which has left me confused now.
You just thought she was, she's on the beach.
No, I just think she looks fantastic in it.
Does,
but now I know what it's referencing. It feels a bit, okay. The other thing is, this was really when I just hugely got into Doctor Who, and Doctor Who Weekly was around, and I even remember reading a little article in, it was either weekly or monthly, with there's a new producer, whatever that meant at the time. I watched this and missed the last episode because I had to take part in Redditch Carnival on the Robert Raikes, founder of the Sunday Schools, float. And when I got home, my brother described the last episode.
Right.
I said, what happened? He said, the Doctor went into the generator. Pangol went into the generator with his helmet, and hundreds of him came out, but they all picked their helmets off, and it was the Doctor. And I thought, this sounds amazing. And like 20 years later, when I got to watch it, it was it's a fantastic idea, I think. But yeah, the gap between the idea and the rendering, which I'm sure is a bad thing to bring up on a Doctor Who podcast because it happens so often. But it was it's the whole thing of reading a target book and then seeing the reality.
It's also the second Tom Baker story we've reviewed in a row that ends with the mask coming off and it was the Doctor all along. It was the fourth Doctor all along.
But no, I think that's just a really smart idea. But did you find the new more satisfying, or had you lost interest entirely by this?
No. Like I said at the top of the show, I thought this was not great, but not terrible. I quite enjoyed it. It was on. I guess what I'd like to sort of perhaps nail down right as we come towards the end of discussing this is there are some good ideas, especially the sort of younger generation harking back to the difference between generations and their viewpoints, and he harks back to the nationalism of his grandparents' generation or whatever.
An angry young nationalist actually kind of coming through from a slightly more considered generation. I mean, that's very interesting.
It's really interesting and timeless.
And he isn't just a psychopath. He's just snarky a lot of the time. Isn't he? He's just taking the piss out of his parents while they're dropping dead.
So that's interesting.
It's more like a Harold Pinter character.
Yeah, and absolutely, and that's really interesting. There are some good performances. As we talked about, Tom Baker's reined in a bit, and that seems to help his performance. He's great in the aging process. There's that sense of entropy. There's lots of good things, and yet it still felt to me less than the sum of its parts and rather dull. And I'm just trying to get a sense of why quite it doesn't hang together.
I mean, I really, really like it. However, I know there are all those flaws, and certainly watching it again last night, I think it's top heavy, really. There's a little too much in there, and it's not been... The ingredients haven't been mixed.
Well, that's the thing. I also think it's straining at the leash of what they can do. I mean, it's sort of, it's a flashy start for a new era, but ultimately where it comes a cropper is when it sort of butts up against what it can't do.
And of course, it's followed by Meglos, which we'll review in the fullness of time.
Brilliant. Join us then.
Sometimes on that particular subject, I liked it. I quite liked some creative tension,
I know we've got seconds, but the point is, seems to me dramatically that I go down there, the line comes, it's too dangerous.
Yes.
And as I pick it up, I'm considering whether it's too dangerous, which makes it easier for three.
Yes.
And in spite of it being dangerous, I throw this really prop.
Yes.
Now let's get on with it.
Okay. All right, so...
Having just discussed a serial that involved a mad, crazed nationalist, it seems perhaps appropriate that we move on to the Unquiet Dead, given the controversy we'll get to that. The Unquiet Dead, the third, episode of the first series of New Who back in 2005. It's crazy to think that's over
10 years ago.
Almost 11 years ago. And the setup is sort of a bit like the Leisure Hive, I suppose. They're trying to look for a bit of a holiday. They think they're going to, was it Florence? Naples in 1860, and they end up in Cardiff in 1869. Plenty of jokes about Cardiff being a slightly disappointing place to be, which I'm sure went down well with all the production crew. And then there's sort of ghostly goings on. These the Gelth, these aliens that travel via the gas and the vapors. They're taking over corpses in an undertaker's, and Charles Dickens happens to be there.
And Charles Dickens is there.
And Charles Dickens is there.
That's like probably what they write in the pitch.
And there's all sorts of ghostly goings on, and lots of discussion about rationality versus sort of
Voodoo
spiritualism.
bullshit.
Yeah, voodoo bullshit, that kind of thing. That's the sort of setup. It was written by Mark Gatiss. We've not been hugely flattering about the Crimson Horror when we've discussed that in the past. And directed by Iros Lynn. I think we're pronouncing that correctly. Yep. Apologies to any Welsh listeners if we've not. But who's gone on to do many great other things from BBC in the States as well. So yeah, a bit of pedigree to the directing. But anyway, Jim, what's your overarching take on this? We will get to the sort of controversy about refugees and what have you, I guess, later.
It looms over any discussion of this episode, I think.
I'm going to say, as always, the Eccleston series I just love. And watching this again a couple of weeks back, just hugely enjoyed it. Very enjoyable, but also I can't help but watch it and compare it with the current run. As we record this, we're coming to the end of the second Capaldi season, which we're not going to go on about now. However, once again, comparing it to when I first watched it, really enthused with the comeback. Had really enjoyed Rose, really enjoyed End of the World. And then watching this, I remember liking it, but then the first time I watched it, getting to the end when the Gelf, after everyone's helped out, turn out to be evil. And I've got to say, my response wasn't, this is a terrible metaphor for fear against immigrants. I just thought, what a lazy piece of writing that they have to be evil to give it some drama at the end.
Yes.
I remember that first time watching it thinking, couldn't it have just been a story of the Doctor meets aliens and helps them out, and there's enough weird stuff going on? It's
so funny that you said that, because that's literally that exactly is what I think. So just as a bit of context for people, obviously the Gelf, they're I'm in a room.
Yeah, they're disembodied things, aren't they?
This is a room with three men in it, so the Gelf are not the only a gas that's escaped from a rift. But pity us as we sit here. But no, so there's obviously famously in New Who lore, there's a sort of time-space rift that runs through Cardiff. And the Gelf are sort of appearing through it. And they say that they used to have corporeal form, but now they don't have bodies, and that this is as a result somehow their collateral damage in the Time War. So obviously the Doctor feels very guilty, and essentially they're saying that they're refugees, they're stateless, they have nowhere to go, and they want to come to Cardiff, and
they don't specify Cardiff. It's legendary throughout the universe.
The done with the waterfront is beautiful. They want to arrive on Earth and use cadavers to sort of as a.
And the Doctor entertains this, doesn't he? I mean, that's something that, in that sort of alien morality of the Doctor that they
more than
occasionally
entertains
tap
it.
into.
He pulls up Rose short when she's got no good reason for not liking it, other than it's a bit spooky.
It's a bit weird.
She's a bit freaked by it, but he doesn't even try and well, look at it this way. He's just like, if you can't handle it.
And of course, the controversy, insofar as there is one, is that, of course, they portray themselves as refugees, and it seems like they pretty much are. I mean, I don't think it's disputed in the episode that the reason they've lost corporeal form is because of the Time War. But when they arrive, when they're allowed in numbers to come through the rift,
they start taking our jobs.
They start. they want to cause mayhem and havoc, and
they arrive
violence.
en masse and want to conquer.
Yeah.
Their voice goes down a few pitches.
Yeah,
because
and they go from a pleasing, pleasant blue to a fiery, demonic red.
Yeah, that is lazy as, isn't it? That is just visually, that is so lazy. But the thing that I find particularly annoying about that is exactly what Jim said. It was pitching itself as a really interesting. It was plenty spooky enough with them taking over the bodies.
You'd had your frights with people with weird contact lenses stumbling about,
and it's properly well done. I mean, like the makeup and the special effects.
Actually, the whole episode is beautifully made.
Especially the leading in the
great.
pre-credits when the elder lady sort of walks right into the camera screaming. It's
that whole cold,
and the bit where she grabs his
opening,
neck and
that whole opening sequence is brilliant. And I think it's one of the best pre-credits we've had in New Who.
It is. But I remember the excitement of that's the third.
We've got another one as he's trying to get it back in the coffin.
It goes from Hammer Horror to more like a Spike Milligan thing.
Yeah, it's great.
Like
all of that is plenty, and of course there's Charles Dickens, who is to me beautifully, wonderfully played by Simon Callow, and his the confusion that he has about his sort of rational worldview being being undermined and challenged. Not really. In the end, it's not really undermined, but challenged by the possibility of discovery. And it's a neat sort of very. I mean, I know it's a Gators episode, but it's a very Russell T Davies idea that there's always more to discover. There's always, there's an optimism there that actually you shouldn't have a closed mind. There's always something else to learn.
Well, and that's kind of stamped through this whole series, and they kind of, I mean, to an extent, they kind of they don't put it across very subtly, but that idea of kind of fresh thinking and keeping an open mind or something is sort of stamped through almost every aspect of this.
Yeah, it's much more about that. It's about trying to get the audience, hopefully, to think about things in a slightly different way. Not necessarily believe in aliens, but just step outside your little comfort zone a little bit.
Let's just wrap up this discussion of the ending, because I think there's a lot to discuss here, and I think there's a lot to admire.
Well,
but the ending, I think, basically, you're right. It's being criticised for subtext. I think the subtext is deeply clumsy, and certainly I don't think people are looking too hard into it to find something to get upset about. It's very much there, but I think it sort of comes out of a combination of some, it's a very lazy denouement anyway. Obviously he feels he's painted himself into a corner and has to get out, and in the process adds a very clumsy note to it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone was actually thinking, we're gonna
really stick it to the immigrants.
I think it was just lazy. And
this is a bit of a recurrent problem with Gatiss, though. Is the other thing is that, I mean, his scripts, I think, more than others, and I think I've been very critical of his writing for Doctor Who. I really like this episode. I think it's great, and I've got very little bad to say about it. And I think it's by far and away his best contribution to the series.
Agreed.
But there are so many occasions where his scripts sort of do hit a bum note that feels really ill-advised and perhaps should have been knocked out in an early draft. So I'm thinking the Jenny and the Doctor kiss in Crimson Horror, but also in Sleep No More, which went
forced
out...
Kiss.
Yeah, Forced Kiss.
Yeah.
But also Sleep No More, which went out, well, as we record it, went out a couple of weeks ago. That sort of casual mashing up of India and Japan as a result of tectonic activity to create this sort of bland hybrid culture is a really problematic idea really shouldn't have been. And
I don't want to go too much into it, but also the casting of the transgender
casting
actor.
Doctor Who's first transgender actress as a sort of idiotic grunt character.
Yeah, it was just
not a good idea either.
In fairness, these things aren't necessarily Gatiss' fault.
No,
we don't know how much his scripts get rewritten, and it's
no. I mean, that's the thing. There's plenty to criticise about. Well, all seasons of modern Doctor Who, but
Matt's right.
The thing
every
about
time
the
he
Gatiss
writes
episode, there's always something which is clearly unintentional, but deeply problematic.
I agree.
No smoke without terrible writing.
Well, I want to. I really want to agree with Matt there. I absolutely. I mean, knowing what we do about Gatiss.
That sounds really sinister.
Knowing we got the dossier here. Knowing what we do about Gatiss, it's vanishingly unlikely that he intended to stick it to the immigrants with this episode.
No, and in fact, he's a great campaigner for a lot of liberal causes.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's very unlikely. But I agree that it is. I think you're not looking too hard to find something that's leaves a bit of a nasty
clumsy and
taste.
should have been spotted.
Yeah, clumsy and should have been spotted. However, and as Jim pointed out, just narratively, you too, Matt, narratively, it's very lazy that they arrive and they're evil. And actually, I agree with Jim. It was actually much more interesting, that bit where the Doctor, and he doesn't really talk about it, but it's just with the facial expressions, the guilt of having participated in the events that led them to be effectively stateless. We'd had all the spooky stuff with the cadavers, and it was in a mortuary, and not a mortuary, sorry. It was in an undertaker's, and all that stuff. We'd had our spooks and bits of fun, and Simon Callow as Charles Dickens is a crazy sort of Doctor Who style mashup. I just felt we didn't really need that sort of and they're evil. Okay,
no, not at all.
And it is a great episode generally. All
right, so let's. Yeah, I think there's sort of a couple of big things to discuss here.
Yeah, are we going to go deep diving, as they say it?
But let's take a deep dive into the Unquiet Dead.
Dive into it.
I think it's very interesting. This is episode 3, and it's a historical, and it's unabashedly taking
it's Hinchcliffing a little bit.
It is, I mean, it's definitely
rightfully so.
A supernatural historical.
It's the third consecutive week when this show, which I think, as I've said previously, back when this was on in 2005, you just didn't get shows like Doctor Who. You had game shows and talent contests and stuff, and emergency service dramas.
What kind of stuff I generally make.
Yes. And for this,
Not
you could imagine people watching Rose, the first episode, and thinking, I've seen Doctor Who, that's what it's going to be every week. And the next week is Eurovision in space. And then the next week you've got this kind of Victorian
drama,
stuff.
yeah.
And it's just so fantastic that you're going from pillar to post every week.
Obviously, it's built into the DNA of the new series that they're saying right up front that we are going to do the past as well. It's not going to just be flashy sci-fi. We're going to do stories from the past. It does sort of set the agenda for what historic Doctor Who is going to be in the modern series. That it's that sort of. I mean, I can't remember who coined the term, but celeb historical. Basically, it's like we will anchor it around a thing or a person that you know, and sort of enjoy popping
Generally
in on them
writer,
to see what they're like.
Generally, a writer that you've not read.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, I think that was actually weirdly that the first time that happened was kind of Pip and Jane doing Mark of the Rani or something. I think,
or he would have been actually, yeah.
Yeah. But anyway,
we do meet H.G. Wells at some point, don't we?
That was a few stories later. Yeah. So
we'll discuss that at the time.
I'm not a huge fan of the celebrity historical. I mean, this is not wanting to preempt when we talk about the Aztecs, but there's a version of historicals I much prefer. However, Simon Callow's fantastic in this. If you're starting off an entire new series, pretty much, you do want to do something like this when you've got a well-known actor and a well-known character that is playing. We've touched on this already in the review, but I think his portrayal, it's not just his acting, I think the way he's written is very good.
Yeah.
Because he's not just, he's there and he's brilliant.
Well, they do something
he's there
very
and he's
interesting
a bit of an
with the
arsehole,
character.
really,
Yeah.
isn't he? Yeah.
But also that kind of, him at the end of his life and sort of doubting everything and thinking he's seen everything and then having a little burst and then saying, but these would be his final months, but thanks to the Doctor, he'd sort of lived them out quite happily. It's not just taking the kind of the conventional. I think a couple of months ago you described it as like basically when new series generally does celeb historicals, it's based around just what you know, and that is rendered on screen.
Heard, Whereas this, it's not just that he's the world weary guy, and at the end he's seen some sort of new sheen on life. It's the bit when he really doesn't want to accept that he's seen something he can't cope with, and he wanders off, and the Doctor's a bit short with him, but then does make the time to sort of kind of apologise to him.
He does,
but more kind of not so much apologise as say you have to realise this is what's happening. And blah,
that's
blah,
the thing. The only two sort of celeb historicals.
He does apologise for his tone.
Yeah.
And that's quite an interesting.
But it's explaining why rather than just saying, it's
exactly.
way out of order.
But it just felt really really in terms of the way the characters were interacting, that felt very satisfying. That he would have said sorry for my tone, and it wasn't just plot point. The character arrived very fully formed, as you say, in the writing and the performance. The performance is really amazing.
It's great. And, it was like, I think it's possible to... I mean, Simon Callow always plays Dickens. I think Simon Callow spends about 11 months of the year dressed as Charles Dickens.
He certainly does a great Christmas show.
He's got it screwed down here. I mean, it is brilliant, and it's obviously a man who knows and understands the psychology of the character.
Well, he is a biographer.
Yeah.
I mean, he's written biographies and he's and
Orson
reviews
Welles as well.
Yeah, the Orson Welles biography is just out. So he when he does research on a character such as Dickens, that he really does know.
But that's what makes this work, I think, is the insight into the character and the treatment of Charles Dickens as a dramatic character in this context, rather than. I mean, if you think the only other sort of variant on this theme that I sort of rate to any great extent from the new series would be the Vincent van Gogh one, which is obviously that's going into his depression and an idea of what depression might be, and wrangling with his internal demons.
I don't think it's. I don't necessarily want to spoiler the 30-minute conversation we're going to have about the Shakespeare Code,
But that's a definite thing of, Shakespeare was a crazy kind of
but then
pop
also
star.
Shakespeare, Queen Victoria, Hitler, these other historic characters that have popped up.
Are all here.
and they're here tonight.
They'll be guesting on next month's podcast.
But surprise, surprise, Matthew.
But the sort of, the use of those characters there is very much just to say, oh, it's Hitler, oh, it's Queen Victoria, kind of thing, and to have
I've heard of Agatha Christie.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas, this and Vincent and the Doctor sort of feel are at least two where they say, well, let's go into a bit of depth as to who these people were and how they can fit into a story, into a Doctor Who story.
Yeah, I mean, and again, this is early days for the series, so a lot of what's the conflict here is actually between the Doctor and Rose about she thinks she's having a great time travelling, in inverted commas, the world, i.e. time and space, and the Doctor's having to pick, she's taken umbrage with stuff and the Doctor's having to pick her up on it. It got a bit of a cliche after a while, but there was all this stuff about Rose going, the aliens, they're so alien, and her in this putting her foot in the snow,
the wonder of it all.
I'm back in time. It's all gone, but it's like here still.
Thousand sunsets that you can experience any time. Yes, it's like,
it's a little bit.
All right, back off.
Is it still working for you here, or are you throwing things at the TV?
I think it works. I think this whole series is kind of done. Well, certainly the early part of this series. Because we kind of got the same when we did Aliens of London. It had a job to do, and it paints it in primary colours now, and but it paints it in primary colours. I think now that, you know, within a couple of years, but certainly now that I think the mythology and the sort of modus operandi of the series is kind of well established, you can kind of abridge that a bit, and you know they've definitely dialed that down in the last sort of few years. But you know, it does the job here. It doesn't feel particularly subtle. But I can't say I dislike it, and I think I sort of admire what they're trying to do.
Rose and... I've forgotten her name.
Eve Miles.
Yes.
Gwyneth.
What's it? Gwyneth, yes. Does that work for you? I mean, that's an interesting thing, which, again, not to preempt the Aztecs, but a problem with a lot of historicals is this thing nowadays of... in history, everyone was just like us, but they wore funny outfits, whereas there's a little bit of effort there to make... There's a cultural conflict between Rose's assumption of how the world works and Gwyneth's assumption of how the world works.
Well, the other thing
is, not in terms of the supernatural
Gwyneth,
stuff, but just what's normal in society.
But Gwyneth also kind of has a role to play as the psychic, and almost that's what's interesting about her. I think if she was just... And you do get this a lot in the kind of new series historicals, that there are characters who are just there to be kind of sounding boards to like sort of clumsily lay out whatever the writer wants to do. Actually, I think what I'd sort of forgotten about, because I've not seen this since it first went out, what I'd forgotten about this was the Gwyneth psychic element. And actually, that's kind of really subtle and elegant, the way they work that in. The bit where she just gives the Doctor his cup of tea and says, there you go, 2 sugars, just the way you like it. And then he goes, oh, thanks. And it's like, what? He kind of does a tiny double take, but it just enough to kind of prick your interest.
That's the genius of Gatiss writing.
One thing that you mentioned, the Aztecs, which we're about to talk about, and I don't want to sort of preempt it too much, but in that... there is a very clear... The Doctor has a very clear view about intervention in history and what have you. That theme is also picked up here when the Doctor says to Rose that your cozy little world can be rewritten like that, and snaps his fingers and sort of says you've got to be very careful about how you intervene. I quite like the way the Doctor has a sort of two sides of a coin relationship with Rose. On the one hand, her naivety and youth is very attractive to him, and he likes the fact that someone sees the world and the universe through unjaded eyes. Yeah. And yet at the same time, he is, you know, when it comes to something
when
really
she's
important,
kind of doing for him in this what he does for Charles Dickens almost.
Yes,
just kind of play it forward.
Precisely.
Kind of,
but at the same time, he is when things are getting to the knife point, he gets very irritated by precisely that naivety and that sort of the fact that she's
but
so
then
green.
That also kind of gets reflected back the other way, because then when Gwyneth is sort of saying that it's interesting actually how all the characters kind of interknit. I'm not sure to what extent it's accidental or intentional, because when they're sort of discussing whether Gwyneth is going to use her gifts to let the girl through, there's that bit where the Doctor's being irritated by Rose sort of naively intervening on Gwyneth's behalf, but then Gwyneth says, you clearly think I'm stupid, I can tell because I can see into your psyche or anything. So actually, the way these sort of 4 core characters all kind of revolve around each other and kind of interact with each other's strengths and weaknesses is pretty elegantly done. It's pretty tight. It's definitely
it's kind of the inverse of the Leisure Hive. It actually does pack a lot of ideas into a very short space of time, quite elegantly.
I agree,
but it's the perfect use of a 45-minute episode. It's 4 characters interacting and bouncing off each other in a dramatic situation. The resolution to the alien threat is incredibly lazy, but actually the takeaway, and that was the thing that I found really exciting about watching this series of Doctor Who and genuinely not knowing where it was going, was this sort of real sense of character development that was hugely enjoyable. I remember the scene at the end of or the last couple of scenes at the end of The World are absolutely amazing. And then this idea that you'd have a very tight space where 4 characters would interact and all learn something about each other was great.
On the subject of the characters, maybe a good opportunity to talk about some of the performances. We obviously have already discussed Simon Callow, but I really enjoyed Alan David as Sneed.
Oh, he's great! Yeah,
the funeral director. You talked about the bit where he says, "We've got another one," and it's just so funny that. And he's this sort of randy old bastard, basically.
Well, allegedly, there's that little throwaway line that doesn't sit well with me actually. When
really?
Rose picks it up saying your hands had a wander or something.
Yeah,
it seems a bit out of character with what we know of it. He just seems a bit of a useless stumblefuck, really. He's been left in this situation, has to deal with it, and hasn't quite got the guts to really do something. But, can we blame him? He's a Victorian undertaker. What's he going to do?
He's got some chloroform on him, though, isn't he?
Yeah, his business is booming.
Weird.
Yeah.
It's interesting that they sort of those sort of characters and the name Sneed as well. I mean, that's
it's a very Dickensian name, isn't it?
Well, yeah, and that's that's been done to death with other adaptations of Dickens, and sort of done to death with different iterations of Doctor Who, saying, well, it'll simultaneously have this character, like the Agatha Christie one, it'll simultaneously have this character but sort of exist in their fictional world as well. But it is really nicely rendered, that. I mean, it doesn't feel too heavy-handed with it.
Eve Miles?
A perfectly good performance, yeah. I mean, it's kind of weird because obviously she went on to do Torchwood, so it's kind of, yeah.
I'm not really... I don't think she's really got the acting chops.
Well, this is the thing. It's like, I remember being quite surprised
if you're
when
listening,
they announced...
Eve, I'm very sorry.
I've been quite surprised when they announced her as the lead actress in Torchwood, the Doctor Who spin-off, because there was all sorts of... Because after they announced that they were doing a spin-off series, and sort of with the success, the career renaissance that Billie Piper had as a result of Doctor Who, I remember pretty much everyone was quite keen to... certainly every agent or publicist was quite keen to attach their client's name to the female lead in Torchwood. I remember like Rachel Stevens being touted like endlessly for that.
Really?
I don't know if she ever screen tested.
Jim perked up.
Yeah,
there was
just
a sense
remembering
that,
Hannah Sperrit in Primeval. Yeah.
Well, that's it. An obvious variation on a theme. You could tell ITV was saying, well, what worked for Doctor Who?
And wasn't the other S Club one in the controversial Celebrity Big Brother?
Yeah.
Was that Joe
O'Meara, wasn't it?
Yes.
The Shilpa Shetty.
Oh, dear. Yeah. Tune into our S Club 7 podcast.
And our Big Brother podcast, where we'll review every episode of Big Brother. And, I like her in Torchwood, actually. I like the idea that, partly because that sort of... Well, partly because bits of Torchwood are really good, bits of it are absolutely terrible. You can probably guess which bits, but also that idea of an ass-kicking Welsh female lead in a weird cop show. I don't know, I just quite liked it. But yeah, there's nothing to a performance here that makes you think, well, she's destined for the lead in a big drama.
So that was so we dealt with the performances. Matt,
yeah, take that one.
Matt, you already mentioned that you thought this looked really good. I think the visuals on this, I mean, the way everything comes together, it's such a beautiful Doctor Who idea. You've got Charles Dickens and animated corpses and ghostly things and a seance and Victoriana. But it's really done at a pace. It all comes together very nicely, and it just looks so good.
Well, that was always
really sumptuous, yeah.
The prevailing cliche in sort of the classic Doctor Who era was that the BBC was always much happier with a period setting because that brought the best out of everyone involved because they'd done that before.
Yeah, Primeval Earth in Time Flight being a prime example.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah,
But it's sort of, this is being made, the gap between the old series and the new series is sort of where the costume drama has become the BBC's big bankable calling card. I mean, yeah, there was all sorts of great period dramas made during the 70s and 80s, but in the 90s is when suddenly, things like Pride and Prejudice become international hits. And so it feels both inevitable but quite satisfying that expertise then gets folded back into Doctor Who when it comes back. And it still looks great. I think
the gas lamps are just so...
Yeah.
The fact they're actually functioning gas lamps, things like that, it's really beautiful.
Victoriana's got a big history with Doctor Who. I know it's specifically something with the Hinchcliffe era. I'm not sure what the point I want to make there is, but do you think that's a wise decision? If you're reintroducing Doctor Who, do you think the Victoriana is kind of the perfect historical era you're going to go for to say the TARDIS can go back in time as well?
Well, to a new audience, in terms of like rooting them in and because that, especially that first series of Russell T Davies Doctor Who makes a huge point about how it exists in the TV in the TV landscape. There's constant references to 24-hour rolling news, and the series finishes like the Doctor's regeneration is induced by an experience in the Big Brother house, or leads on from an experience in the Big Brother house. So that idea that you take what you're almost saying with that first series is not just that the TARDIS can travel through time, but the TARDIS can travel through
TV genres.
Through TV genres, exactly. And you've got reality TV, Eurovision Song Contest the previous week, as you said, like rolling news, and here costume drama.
And also there is something always slightly bizarre about the previous generation. So if the 20th century was the era of modernism and mechanism, the Victorian era was an era of empire and stiff collars and God knows what else. And obviously they bring that out in the fact that Rose and Gwyneth have such different worldviews. So I think it's quite, and the costumes are great, right? I mean, if you go back to the, one of the reasons why, if you go back into the history of Doctor Who, you get great historicals is because they've got all the costumes in the cupboard somewhere. You mentioned Time Flight. There wasn't an all Cretaceous Great and Small that they could use for the sort of.
How long have you been preparing that?
There was a great blob monster.
Well, but there isn't something there for that. I think by the time you get to 2005, I doubt very much they're just dusting off old stuff or old sets. They would have all had to be.
Oh, yeah, it's all shot on location.
Yeah, and all the sets would have had to have been built.
But it's more that the expertise is there.
Yeah, I suppose that's
what you're
thing.
sort of tapping into.
Yeah, I mean, it really does look incredible.
It looks really good, and I think there are certain aspects, certainly of the Eccleston series, that technically have aged not so well. I mean, obviously it's like nearly 11 years... Well, it was made 11 years ago.
Well, the fact that it's on SD, I suppose.
The fact that it's on SD and really aggressively graded. I mean, they sort of dialed that back for the David Tennant era, but the way that the colours are all sort of so designed with that sort of artificial film look, I think very much roots it in that kind of mid-noughties era of telly, of, trying to make things look filmic that are shot on standard definition video. But just the direction and the art direction on this, really do stand up. This still looks great, I think.
Proper pacey.
Welcome to Dickens World.
It was the best of attractions, it was the worst of attractions. OK, that's unfair, but it might be how one of Britain's most well-loved authors would have described his own Dickens World, and it opened in May 2007 in Chatham, Kent, just outside of London. But does Dickens World deliver? Certainly, the indoor boat ride is a triumph, and one that both kids and adults will enjoy as you take in those dark and murky elements to Victorian England. Look, there's a casket shutting. Fun for all the family. Pickpockets and thieves present themselves, but really, there's no cause for alarm. The ride is pretty much worth the entrance fee alone, which ranges between £6 and £12.50 in price. That's $12 to $24.
Right, and so for our last story tonight, we're all the way back to 1964, and the sixth ever Doctor Who story, The Aztecs by John Luca Rotti, which is a...
Sorry, couldn't resist. Just Luca Rotti sounded like Pavel.
Oh, I see. I thought you'd lost your mind for a minute.
You're not even drinking today.
I saw his name flash up on the screen and it just made me think of the Go Compare guy. Sorry.
Well, you heard it here first. No other Doctor Who podcast offers you this level of insight into the classics. So this is what fans would refer to as a straight historical, pure or straight historical, in that there are no sci-fi elements here other than the TARDIS crew. And what is it? 16th century Mexico?
Well, it's ahead of the conquistadors.
Yeah, I'm now
mean,
showing my
slightly
limited grasp of history here.
Slightly ahead
One
of it.
person in this room has a
15th
history
century.
degree. 15th century. Okay, so they land in 15th century Mexico. Barbara is the...
Partner wants to go to Cancun, doesn't he?
Barbara is mistaken for the reincarnation of the high priest Tlotoxl. Decides that she has an opportunity to end the barbaric Aztec practice of human sacrifice, and various escape and capture scenarios ensue, I would say, is probably the potted summary of this story.
To some extent.
Broadly, yeah.
I'll pick you up there. I mean, the escape recapture sounds like it's got a very lazy piece of writing or something.
Oh, no, not
I
at
think
all.
this is.
No,
I know that wasn't what you were
prejudice
intending to say, but I think it is a very good investigation of that world, you know.
Well, so, I mean, Jim, presumably
Do you want me to
like
carry
this
on?
by the side of
Okay.
things, just keep talking.
Yeah, I mean, we've already touched on this when we were talking about the Unquiet Dead, but I do think this is a great historical in terms of it's not trying to say, if you go back into the past, people are just like they are now, but in different costumes. This is very much picking up on... There's a phrase in particularly science fiction of world building, and here, obviously, the world already... There are historical facts on it, but I think it does a fantastic job of sketching out that world and spending the 4 episodes investigating what goes on there. And people definitely aren't, they're kind of like today's people.
No.
It's very much the mindset is what it is there.
And that's the dramatic the imperative that drives the story forward, is that they're not like us.
The famous line from this is Barbara trying to change sacrifice. Like, there's so many positive things about this culture, if only we can get rid of the barbaric thing, the sacrifice. And Hartnell's doctor, and admittedly this is early days, he'd probably do something else now, but he says you can't change history, not one line. Which I just think is so aware of, you know, how dare you just go into a civilization and decide you're going to impose your own beliefs and systems, which puts it, even though Star Trek didn't exist at this point, is very much at odds with the Shatner era of Star Trek, where there's the prime directive, but let's bend that and try and make them a little bit more like a proper democratic society and everything. So, I mean, I want you guys to tell me what you think of it.
Well,
but I'd just say I love the fact that it uses all of that. You know, it's an investigation of... It's as an alien as world as you can get, really.
Well, I mean, you were talking about Barbara, you know, as Matt mentioned, she's mistaken for this goddess Tlotoxl. Her arrogance knows no bounds, it would seem, in this. I mean, she at one point, one of the characters, I forget which, I think it may have been the Doctor, saying, "Barbara, you mustn't," and she stops and says, "Not Barbara, Tlotoxl." As if to say, no, to them I'm Tlotoxl, and I am, you know, and she's happy to inhabit this role.
She throws herself into that situation so quickly.
She's like Lady Gaga all of a sudden.
But it reminded, I thought there were, you know, one of the things that my overriding sense, I had not really watched much Hartnell before we did this podcast. You know, there's nothing new. There's nothing new in New Who. And it was so funny. I thought the parallel with the Tennant Time Lord Triumphant thing, where she's saying, no, I will change time. I will make this a better society. I have the power. I've been recognised as a god. All of that is very similar to the Time Lord Triumphant stuff. Look.
It's hubris.
Yeah,
yes.
the hubris of it. And there's an interesting debate, I suspect we'll get onto it in a bit more detail, but there's a really interesting debate about cultural relativism.
And posing as an Aztec god.
Posing as an Aztec god. But
Corbyn's dead against it.
The imposition of quote-unquote liberal values and actually whether one of those values may or may not, should or should not be, that you don't actually impose values. And that tension is really there. Look, the Aztecs... My overarching take, this is absolutely fantastic.
It's brilliant.
It's every conceivable level. I just loved this.
It's no Kinder, obviously, but...
God almighty.
Treat and a surprise.
Mara almighty.
It's stunning. Everything about it is stunning. The dialogue is absolutely... I mean, it absolutely sings. There's so much in this. You know, the Doctor's wistful romance with Kameka.
That's brilliant.
It's unbelievably brilliant. I mean, there's a line which was sort of very...
Well, he uses her so cynically. He's a real shit to her.
But he
goes full Connery.
He pumps her for information and then ditches her. It's like...
Yeah, but he actually really does fancy her.
Yeah.
And he's really sad about it at the end because he's about to leave the trinket that she gave him.
And he was going to get some action.
And he goes back for it. It's really touching, and it's a layer of the character that you perhaps wouldn't associate with Hartnell.
You certainly wouldn't associate with Hartnell in that, the only point where I think the series has felt comfortable enough to reintroduce the idea of a sort of romantic doctor, and we'll say reintroduce as opposed to introduce.
Yes, exactly.
Here it is when the doctors are being played by people in their late 20s and early 30s. So, that idea of sort of no hanky-panky in the TARDIS is, certainly not, something they considered here, where you've got him being played as an elderly man.
Yeah, and obviously it's early days, so they haven't pinned
6.
things down, but it's still a really amazing thing. And I remember as a kid reading précis of this as if, the Doctor gets much to his chagrin or something. It's not at all, is it? He's kind of, he's surprised, but he's quite up for it.
Yeah, and he really rates her as well. No, I
just imagine him having some speech. Oh wow, there was some girl I knew back on.
But he really values her wisdom and her kindness.
No, there's a definite bond between them.
Definitely, but I just the dialogue around it is so funny as well. Obviously he wasn't quite clear about the fact that if you made some cocoa, that was a sign that you got engaged. But the line is, yes, I made some cocoa and got engaged. It's a very Capaldi sort of lie. It's very sort of out there,
it's like
weird.
P.G. Woodhouse or something.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's very. I loved it. I
But also, I mean, he's earthy in this as well. He's a really earthy character. There's that idea of him as a guy who's seen a lot and has quite forthright views. It's. A slightly wider point would be just the interaction of the 4 regulars in this is absolutely pitch perfect because at this point,
particularly the dialogue between Barbara and
Ian,
Susan.
Well, they've certainly got. I mean, obviously, it's like
I thought their friendship was really.
I was going to say I wasn't aware
clear.
Susan doing a huge amount in this.
She's not
already.
in it basically for a couple of episodes. They pre-filmed some scenes so she could get a couple of weeks off.
I mean, technically it'll be that, but you always get the sense they don't really know what to do with her. Whereas obviously the Doctor, Ian and Barbara are much more interesting characters.
I think there is a sense that as a quartet and as an ensemble cast, which obviously it's the Doctor's name over the door, but as an ensemble cast, it's been really thought out what their roles might be. And you see here the idea of like having a science teacher and a history teacher. Plus
for good reason.
Plus an experienced old traveller and an inquisitive young mind. It's like it's laser focused to tell the variety of stories that they want to tell at this point. So, here this is Barbara's story because she's interacting with her own understanding of history and her own views on what went on versus the reality. In the sci-fi stories, you can use Ian as both sort of technical inquiry and muscle.
This is how static works.
Yeah, exactly. Well, pretty much. It's all about how static works. But the Doctor is, it's not just that he is the centre of gravity to this and all the other characters are peripheral. He has his role to play in the action, but, he's full of righteous fury and
as well, yeah. I suppose he's the Ben Kenobi in this, isn't he? He's the wise old guy in the background, but he's fantastic in it.
I mean,
they're already trying to soften him up somewhat from earlier the few stories before this when he's more just the facilitator. He's
he's
the
less
guy who
of
has
an
the machine that
bastard, essentially than he is in the earlier stories. But there's still that, that scene where the you can't change history, not one line scene is amazing. I think not even just for his delivery of that line, but all the lines around it when he says, "Believe me, Barbara, I know," and he's yelling at her basically, and really kind of
and I as we go on, I think less and less of that as just a dramatic conceit of don't mess with time. It's going back to John's cultural relativism. I think it's more like don't get yourself involved in this. Whatever you try and do isn't going to work.
It's not going to work out. But also, I mean, like aside whether this sort of
morally as well as just the consequences.
But it's also, and I mean, I remember something because we discussed this kind of at length when we looked at the gunfighters about whether or not the idea of the straight historical can work in Doctor Who without supernatural elements. And you, Jim, had always said that you sort of quite liked the idea and wish they'd tried it more often. And John and I think were sort of little more on the fence about how the presence of the TARDIS crew can detract from buying into this as the First World War or the OK Corral because, you're putting an upper limit on how authentic that portrayal of the environment can
and
be.
yet this serial completely torpedoes our argument.
Well, because
it's so good.
Yeah, I mean, it completely torpedoes the
You
argument.
anachronistically mentioned torpedoes. It's just terrible.
Sorry.
But because what it's doing is, and what is this? Oh no, it's not the first historic setting we've seen since the first. So they've kind of alternated so far between history, sci-fi,
Pretty much, Marco Polo would be the
Yeah.
first historical before this, which is a somewhat different story. But yeah, going back to the gunfighters is very much playing on Hollywood film cliches rather than, looking
But
at the
they
historical
square the
setting.
circle of how you put these characters in a historic setting and still tell a worthwhile historic story, simply by asking the question, what would it be for you to go back in time and be in that environment, and how would your prejudices be challenged? How would your assumptions be confronted?
In some ways, it's like a straight-faced version of Blackadder. It's what if you had modern sensibilities and were put into that world.
So in some ways, it's not trying to. It's not about Aztec society. I mean, it is, in that's where it all happens. But it's not about Aztec society. It's about confronting your received notions of history in the past. And I kind of think, if every historical was then subsequent, there's only so many times you can do that. And obviously, every idea that Doctor Who has at this point is an original idea for Doctor Who, because most of it's not been done before.
Except the Terry Nation one.
Except who already, within the first 5 series, had managed to repeat himself endlessly.
Yes.
But, well, actually, that's an interesting point, that they were working on quite a small pool of writers at this point, that out of the first 6 stories, of which this is number 6, you've got 2 Terry Nations and 2 John Lucarottis at this point.
And the script editor filling in the rest.
Yeah, pretty much.
Sorry, Anthony Coburn as well. So.
Well, and Cecil Bunny Weber. No, I don't. We'd get into that. But, it's you probably couldn't ask that question too many more times, which is why I think the sort of historicals, they kind of lose their way a bit and are eventually phased out. Because you can't just continually ask. Well,
it does
what
carry
would it be
on
like to go into the past.
It does carry on for a few more years, but they do seem to alternate between the carry-on version of history and the straight version to keep some variety in there. I mean, it's a fantastic story. Come on, John, you couldn't have enough many good things to say about it.
Really echoing what Matt said, just from a narrative structure point of view as well. This is really tight television. It's really well structured. You were talking about the Doctor's anger and his concern about the sort of meddling and what have you, but he channels his efforts into trying to work out how they can get into the room in the temple that the TARDIS is trapped in. So you've got 3 parallel stories that are all running and set up very nicely in episode 1 and the very beginning of episode 2.
So efficiently as well. I mean, it's basically they walk through a door and then realise it's locked behind them, and the entire,
which happened a lot to begin with. They had to have a reason to stay there rather than why don't we bugger off. So it's a while before the crew just stated,
it's like we've locked ourselves out and we'll spend 4 episodes trying to get back in, but everything that's thrown at us along the way.
By the end of this series, it's more we have to stay here and sort this problem out for everybody.
But the and that opening, by the way, is I think the direction on this is absolutely superb. And that opening shot on the scary mask and them arriving there, and it's a straight down angle onto the scary mask. They arrive, the door shuts behind them, bang. It's very Indiana Jones, and they're straight in. It's very, very nicely done. And the 3 stories that we've got running, obviously the Doctor is doing all this research to try to work out the architecture of the temple to get back inside this locked tomb.
And he's got it going on.
And he's got it going on with Kameka. There's Ian, who's being forced to be trained to become a warrior. And
with the short back and sides.
Yeah. and the friction he has with the chief warrior.
Are we going to? Oh, that's Iktar, isn't it?
Iktar,
is the warrior.
And then the third perhaps more moral strand is the sort of tension between the 2 priests, Tlotoxl and Tlotoxl.
Is that how we're going to? Can we agree on a pronunciation?
Tlotoxl.
Iroslin, it's pronounced.
Tlotoxl. And of course, Tlotoxl is the priest of knowledge, and Tlotoxl is the priest of sacrifice. Or
overacting.
Yeah. Well, I'll come to that.
Well, it's entirely suited to the.
Yeah. But the priest of knowledge. What I really love about this is so complicated that Ortlock is the priest of knowledge, and he's meant to be the more sort of considered one, and he's the ally of Barbara, who's in her quote-unquote civilizing mission. And yet, actually, as the man of reason, he only stays on side out of religious loyalties. He attacks her. So, in fact, Barbara thinks that he is this big, enlightened character, but actually, he's only relatively enlightened. And actually, the only way she can continue to keep him as an ally is to continually lie to him, to continually deceive him.
And to extend that further, Tlotoxl is completely right. I mean, he calls the situation. I mean, whether or not he does.
He calls bullshit on it pretty early.
He's the villain, but he's absolutely correct. He
In
builds her
episode-
up for being a false god.
You know, someone's trying to take
and knows
advantage
that someone's
of
trying
their
to take the piss
structure.
in order to bring down their civilization, or at least materially, or at least alter it.
In episode 1, and I want to get on to the performance of Tlotoxl.
John Ringham?
Yes, John Ringham, who
He's amazing.
who is put in a Larry Olivier Richard III wig, and has decided, that's exactly how I'm going to play it.
Yeah.
So it's hammy, it's overdone.
Speeches to the camera.
Yeah.
There's cliffhangers when he just stares down the camera.
Yeah,
But that cliffhanger at
episode
the end
1.
of episode 1 is outstanding. It's just
Yeah,
him.
it's this is a false goddess, and I shall destroy her. And you look
Just,
straight into the
straight down
camera.
the barrel.
Yeah, and so it's hammy, it's overdone, it's overwrought, and it's absolutely perfect.
You don't want anything else.
No, he's a pantomime. He's boo-hiss pantomime
Because
villain.
all the performances, including all the supporting performances, are sort of done in the classical style, really. And it's interesting that doing sort of historic drama. I think a certain style of acting creeps into television anyway. That's sort of half stage, half film.
Well, it's been said before,
further down the line.
At this era, TV was much more like filmed theatre.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting we did the Leisure Hive to begin with this, which was much more about trying to do cinema in Doctor Who, So,
But I mean,
this
it's
works.
given the full welly of sort of Shakespearean classical performances, and I think he's all the better for it. That there's no. It's pretty grim, this story, but there's no knockabout in the performances. There's no one winking to the camera, or no one doing a sort of cliched talk kind of thing that you get a lot later on. It's like they're committed to doing this as classical drama.
Yeah.
And
I mean, the payoff of this is pretty much foreign policy. Oh, we've screwed it up. Let's get out of here as fast as possible.
Yeah. I mean, it's really striking, that contrast between the Doctor, who emerges in the Aztecs as a moral relativist, and Barbara is the liberal evangelist, constantly talking about interventions, and all of the interventions she makes are what creates the problems that they then have to get out of.
Yeah.
So, agree with that or not, it's a very interesting dynamic that they've played with, and it's hugely. I mean, I'm sure they weren't thinking about the potential bombing of Syria in 2015, 2016, but it seemed very relevant when I was watching it to the current day events.
But obviously that goes back through history, doesn't it? Especially as the British Empire was dropping to pieces at this point. So there's a lot of that to take on board. We've not talked much about Ian's thing. I mean, he's pretty much, I was going to say James Bond. He's the action man in this, isn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's great.
He is really good. I
think the fights are generally. If I had one criticism of the Aztecs,
it's going to be the polystyrene block that they have to move out of the way of
and the fights. The fight scenes are generally quite laboured and poor, with the exception of the very final fight.
This isn't the one with the poison thorn or whatever it is.
No. The final fight at the end of episode 4.
The poison thorn's supplied by the Doctor as well.
I know. I really love that.
Really
that's such a lovely kind of screw up of him. Yeah. I'll help you out.
It's sort of arrogance of like, I can sort this out.
I've killed off my friend. Yes,
Oh, shit.
Yes.
But that final fight at the very top of the steps, in where he what's Iktar, where he eventually throws Iktar to a pretty grim death,
which is a lovely thing. I don't know if you saw the making of on this, but that's just done by him lying flat on his back, but they turned it upside down. It's such a lovely, simple effect, but it looks like it conveys the idea that he's dropped from a great height.
Yeah. No, but I thought that final fight, because they film it much, much closer, and they do it with point of view shots as well, it's really dynamic in a way that they couldn't do when they're doing the fight with the crowd around them, because then you need a longer shot. But when it's just the two of them at the top of those steps, they're able to get really tight in, and that's when you can get good fight scenes.
Well, some of the other kind of quote unquote action scenes are great as well. I mean, I was thinking of the the first human sacrifice who jumps off the
Is
jumps off the
nonplussed,
temple.
which is a fantastic scene. Barbara's trying to stop the sacrifice, and when she successfully does that, the sacrifice is not
Expecting
happy
a
at
degree
all.
of gratitude.
It's like, this is really important to me, and throws himself off the top of whatever it is, ziggurat
But that
or whatever
shot
it
of
is,
him
it's-
sort of jumping off the temple, and there's a little sound sting. So the music on this is by Richard Rodney Bennett, who is something of a renowned British composer. Full stop. It's quite prestigious to get him involved in this. But it's a mix of sort of small ensemble kind of chamber strings, and then some weird sort of radiophonic kind of effects. And there's a recurrent sort of kind of sound that they play, the sort of reverse cymbal and white noise and filter and stuff that punctuates those dramatic moments.
Yeah.
And the first time they play it is where the human sacrifice throws himself off the top of the temple. And that scene sent shivers down my spine. It's like... and it's sort of almost the first real indication of just how unstuck Barbara's plan is going to come. It's like the fact that he's prepared to do that.
Yeah, I mean, Matt, it sent shivers down your spine. The rest of the passengers on the flight?
I watched this on a flight back from LA in the week and got some quite odd looks that I'd shunned the in-flight entertainment system in order to watch the Aztecs on my iPad. There's something I'd quite like to get into here because I think it ties together a few lines from the Unquiet Dead and this, which is the show's somewhat... The show's never had a clear line on what history is and what it can be.
Yeah, at this point it's a sandpit, isn't it, for adventures. So.
Throughout Doctor Who, it's always made clear that to intervene in history is a problematic thing, but the idea that the Doctor says you can't change
running the story.
Well, yeah. You got this idea here that you can't change history, not one line, is directly contradicted by in the previous story we had where the Doctor says your cosy little world could be rewritten just like that. You could die in 1860. The way it all pans out is that Barbara attempts to change civilization and cannot or doesn't successfully. No. So it's always like those unintended consequences. Yes, they probably would have cut that guy's heart out, and she successfully stopped them doing that, but he's still dead because he threw himself off, which kind of looks forward to...
And there'll be any number of other sacrifices.
Yes.
And her last thing is pretty much reflecting, it's such a shame Cortez will come along in a few years and, this will all be...
You're going to say Waters of Mars.
I'm going to say Waters of Mars.
Yeah.
I mean, exactly. It was you picked up on earlier, but sort of that idea that the Doctor, attempts to intervene... and is able to change some of the details of what goes on, but the outcome is still the same. The Lindsay Graham?
Lindsay Duncan.
Lindsay Duncan, that's it. Lindsay Graham's a US senator, isn't he?
Yes, that's right.
Yes, okay. The Lindsay Duncan character.
Will be guesting in this year's Christmas special, so...
Brilliant. I look forward to it.
Yeah.
But the Lindsay Duncan character is... supposedly supposed to die on Mars, ends up dying on Earth at her own hand, but, the overall details are the same. What I was trying to work out is...
Because she thinks the Doctor's an arrogant arsehole.
Well, yeah, and this is the thing. So I can't quite get my head around what the Doctor's saying here, whether he's saying that you can't change history or you shouldn't change history. Is he saying, is it not possible to change history, or is he saying this is a terrible idea?
I always thought this was some dramatic conceit of we can't change history because it's going to have such a knock-on effect if we go to the modern day.
As in, obviously, we shouldn't change history.
In 1964, no one's going to think of that. I'm thinking it's more of John's point about cultural relativism. It's Hartnell's Doctor as a mouthpiece to say, don't try and step in and try and change someone else's culture. By the time you get to Waters of Mars, that's a definite point about the Doctor's arrogance. This is more, I think at this point, the point of this story in 1964 is to say this is how the Aztecs lived, and to demonstrate that to children, And
I mean, obviously
that's
the imperative that's sort of running under it. It's not kind of the show has only ever used the mechanics of time travel as a means to an end. Generally,
I think Russell T Davies essentially and brilliantly solved this problem of the Doctor,
it's a fixed point, it's not a fixed point.
Yes, exactly. And I think that allows Doctor Who it allows Doctor Who's scriptwriters to decide that week the imperative
we're going to change history.
Yeah,
or we're not.
We're going to change history, or the imperative is that we don't change history.
Well, because, and I mean, this is me being a really picky arsehole about this, but theoretically, anything that happens in the passage of time from one perspective or another is history. So the Doctor saying that you can't change history, I mean, theoretically...
Everything's history to him. He's been to the end of the universe.
Well, but everything is history, full stop. You know, it's like for people on future generations in Skaro or Marinus, what he did a few years earlier would be history. You know, it's like he's almost saying you can't have any you can't. He's preaching inaction here, but he's also saying that if it's not pre-1964 history.
So the point is to think what was the writer's intention with that line, and I think it's leave well enough alone rather than anything about science fiction and time, the Back to the Future type of stuff.
Oh yeah, no, I completely agree with you.
Leave this alone.
Just getting into a bit of continuity porn here is essentially.
It's domestic. Don't get involved, son.
Fixed points.
That's basically what. But the fixed points thing, I think, really does solve it for the. It does solve it. It just because then it allows the scriptwriter on the basis of their whim to decide whether this week it's one that can change or one that can't. I do think, however,
because the fixed points that we know about do seem fairly arbitrary.
Well, my favourite is obviously the Dalek who is engaged in destroying reality as a concept in Journey's End, who then looks at the young Lindsay Duncan and think, she's going to go to Mars, her daughter goes to Mars or something, or has a cross marriage or something. I better leave that alone. Jesus Christ.
She can be spared the destruction of reality.
Yes.
But despite the fact that the Doctor counsels so strongly against Barbara's intervention in this society, that doesn't stop him being continually contemptuous of that society himself. I mean,
absolutely.
He openly chuckles.
Do you think he's just being lazy? Pretty much saying to someone else, don't make any more problems for me, but I know what I'm doing.
No. Well, I think there is... I mean, there's a certain degree of arrogance in that.
There's a lot of arrogance. Arrogance and impetuous.
He actually apologises even. I think it's in episode 2 where he really gets angry with Barbara and then comes back and says, look, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have shouted at you, which is quite a nice natural moment. A bit like the Doctor and Charles Dickens in Unquiet Dead, where he also loses his rag and then gets apologises. But although he's counselling very strongly against intervention, he openly chuckles and laughs every time one of the characters says some stupid bloody superstitious thing. You know, it's like, yes,
well, because that's that. I think that again, it's in that same speech, the Can't Change History, Not One Line, where he says. Human sacrifice is their culture, it's their religion. And the sort of thing that's underpinning it, he's saying, we don't have to like it, we don't have to agree with it. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but that's what that is. You can't just go, picking and choosing your way through it.
I do think, however, there is a big difference between, let's say, being a time traveller and not intervening because of the knock-on effect it will have, or because it's just completely inappropriate to intervene with certain ideas that won't be developed for several hundred years. I think mileage will vary as to whether that is an approach that could be, successfully plonked onto any number of situations in the here and now. If you've got particular frictions between different communities in the UK, for example, from different backgrounds or whatever, to what extent does the moral relativism of the Hartnell Doctor, can you really apply that to that? I mean, I'm sure they weren't thinking about how it was going to be played in 50 odd years, but I think that insofar as I'm not sure that the Aztecs definitively tells you moral relativism is absolutely perfect and you shouldn't intervene. It does, however, throw open all of the questions and the debate about how you can look at situations like that. Should you intervene? What would be the consequences of intervening? What is the moral result of not intervening, etc.?
I don't think it puts down Barbara. I don't think the good examples you come when she maybe gets a bit sort of drunk on her own position, but I don't think it ever at any point says she's super arrogant. There are good reasons why she would want to.
She has a firm moral underpinning in her disgust for what's going on
from
here.
a good place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Isn't it fascinating that this is the second Hartnell... Well, it's the third Hartnell story we've reviewed, isn't it? Oh, no, fourth. Sorry, tell a lie.
If you count the Christmas
the longer this
one episode,
podcast goes on for, the harder this is going to be.
Well, there's a lot of Hartnell to get through.
There is a lot of Hartnell to get through, but it's amazing that thinking of something like this and the War Machines a couple of years later, like the series was, I don't think accidentally breaking open these issues that still feel fascinatingly evergreen to discuss
Got a
today.
moral agenda, I think. I mean, the thing I was going to ask is, I got the sense John hadn't watched a huge amount of Hartnell before we started this. How is he shaping up for you so far? And I've got to say, we're sort of selecting these stories, trying to mix them around a little bit so you're not getting a glut of all the same thing at once, you know.
Well, I mean,
On the basis of the War Machines, the Feast of Stephen, the gunfighters and the Aztecs.
I've hugely enjoyed watching so much telly for this podcast, and I've
always a
hugely
treat.
enjoyed recording. Amazingly, I've hugely enjoyed recording it with you two.
Is this your last episode? Are you signing off?
But
my doctor's had
the
a word
biggest
with me.
takeaway, the biggest joy for me is discovering the Hartnell Doctor. I absolutely love him. I think he's terrific.
And what a great actor as well. I mean,
Yes.
that's the thing that I always find...
Well, you were
so-
discussing this the other day.
I find it so infuriating when people just sort of treat him as the character, and I think to a certain extent you do get that a lot later on, where the character starts to mesh with the actor. I mean, John Pertwee, Tom Baker, that's obviously a huge part of it. So I think there's this idea that because the Doctor could occasionally be vague or aloof, plus combined with what we know about William Hartnell's health problems, there's this idea that...
And the fact it was done in one shot a lot of the times as well, So the Billy Fluffs, I'm sure all the actors would have done that if they'd only been
all of the
had one
actors
take.
fluff to a certain extent, but I do think that every aspect of the First Doctor is a carefully worked out character decision made by an incredibly strong actor.
Yeah, as we say, this is the 6th story, and even by then they'd start to think the Doctor just can't carry on being an obstinate old man. We've got to make him a somewhat likeable character and a hero to some extent.
They get all the benefit of a great actor performing the role, and I think that's what Hartnell isn't so often sort of acclaimed about, that especially when we're used to the idea of the earlier Doctors being extensions of the personalities that portrayed them. Hartnell is a brilliant actor. He has a great read on all the situations that he needs to portray and what he needs to get across.
Well,
I think he's
1960.
outstanding.
This is 64, right?
Yes.
But in the late 50s and the early 60s, he was still doing those sort of like bluff sergeant major type characters and what have you. You can tell how good an actor he is.
He's only 55 as well. He's playing a much older man. He's
Yeah, I mean,
convincingly.
you can tell how
Younger
good an
than
actor.
Capaldi. I mean, he could have been there with his Fender Stratocaster and his shades.
But you can tell how good an actor he is by the fact, because a lot of people say, "Oh, he's just very doddery. That's all coming. That's just him being old and doddery." As you say, I mean, he had failing health, but he was only 55. And if you look at the other characters he plays in other films,
He wasn't senile.
No, and if you look at the other characters he plays in other films, he's not like that. So it's clearly a mannered, correctly framed performance, and I think it's superb.
Television programs like Doctor Who and the Aztecs is the combined work of a whole team of people. That's the important point. It isn't just the little actors getting up in front of the cameras and spouting. There's been a writer, most important man of all, or woman. There's the director, there's the cameraman, there's the lighting fellas, there's the props, the wardrobe, makeup, as well as the actors. And it is this which makes the whole business quite exciting.
Okay, so that wraps up our leisure and tourism episode of I'll Explain Later. And it's quite nice to have 3 shows that I think we all actually quite enjoyed, didn't we?
Yes, join us. I don't know. Do you guys know what we've got scheduled for next time?
I don't actually. I haven't busted open the spreadsheet.
Ooh, okay. It may not be as positive.
Okay, on that bombshell.
Join us in February.
The cruelest month.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.